Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're ready to get started.
Can I ask you a question?
Ready to get going? Yes.
Okay, so my question is not about the Kabbalah Cafe, but basically, I wanted to know why sometimes in Israel, the Torah portion is not synced up with the rest of the world. And it's two questions, two parts of it. One, is it only Israel? And secondly, why and when does this happen?
Okay. The answer is yes, it's only Israel, because Israelis like to be different. No, that's not the reason. But the reason is it's a very technical reason. It has to do with the way the Jewish calendar works. And that is that in the diaspora, we have 2-day holidays on Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, as opposed to Israel, where they only have 1-day holidays. Therefore, on certain years, when we have a holiday that's on a Friday and a Saturday in the diaspora, so the Saturday for us is a day in which we're reading the holiday reading, because it's part of the holiday. So for example, this year on Shavuot, if you remember, was a Friday and a Saturday. So second day of Shavuot was a Saturday, and we were reading a Shavuot reading for the second day of the holiday. But in Israel, it was not a holiday anymore. It was a regular Shabbat. So they had to begin reading the next Shabbat's Torah reading, which we couldn't because we were reading the holiday reading, which means now that they're one portion ahead of us. That's what happens. So it's not going to happen all the time. It happens whenever you have that Friday, Saturday holiday situation. Then what happens is that for a few months, a few weeks, they're one portion ahead of us. And then what happens, how we resync it, is that on a weekend where we are reading two portions together, in Israel, they read it as 2 separate weeks. And that way we catch up and we're back in sync. And that's how the system works. And of course, that's important because I always tell people, especially if you're preparing for a bar or bat mitzvah in the land of Israel, it's important that you check the calendar in Israel, an Israeli calendar, to see what portion it's going to be that week in Israel, because it may not be the same as it is in the diaspora, depending on the situation. And of course, that would be a very great shame for a kid to spend a year preparing and show up to Israel and find out that they've prepared the wrong portion. That's tragic. So that's as far as that goes. Okay, so we are ready to begin. Thank you everyone for being on with us today. We are very excited to be learning the Kabbalah Cafe. I'm gonna put everyone on mute just for the sake of sound. And then of course we'll unmute for some questions along the way. Okay, so we are ready to begin. And you start with a story. They say there's a story about a nursing home in which an elderly Jewish gentleman, he's about 107 years old. He's started to court this elderly lady who's 105. And one day he decides he's going to propose. So he proposes to her. He says, "Would you like to get married?" And she says, "Yes." And of course, the next day he wakes up, and for the life of him, he knows he asked her, but he can't remember what she said, yes or no. And he just can't remember. So he feels really embarrassed. He doesn't know what to do, but he has no choice. So he goes over to the lady and he says to the lady, you know, "I'm very embarrassed to have to admit this, but I know that I asked you and I know you answered, but I don't remember if you answered yes or no." And she looks at him, she says, "Thank God you came to me, because I know someone proposed to me yesterday and I said yes, I just don't remember who it was. So thank God you came." So our mental capacities are a great, great blessing while we have them. They're great blessings. And today we want to talk about how we use those mental capacities. I want to talk about how we use those mental capacities. In Jewish tradition, scholarship, study, has always played a very, very important role. In fact, not only just an important role, but really, one could argue, the most prominent and central role within Jewish life has always been study and scholarship. And as I've said many times before, traditionally the idea of study was always one in which a person The default setting was one of learning, of studying. In other words, Jewish people traditionally throughout the generations were always seen with books, reading, learning. If you weren't doing anything else, you were reading and learning and studying, because study in Jewish tradition has always been key and central to our spiritual lives. And in fact, in our prayers in the morning, we say that it corresponds and it equals all the other different mitzvot, commandments that we have. This is as great as all of them. This is as great as all of them. So the question we'd like to explore today is what is the role of scholarship? Why are we obsessed with it? And why is it so important? And hopefully from this to come away with a deeper appreciation of the importance of study, specifically Jewish study, in our lives. So number one, on a very practical level, and we're going to explore this on many different levels, on a very practical level, Judaism is filled with commandments, things that we're supposed to do. And of course, if you want to know what to do, you have to study it. So on a very simple level, the concept of Torah study is the concept of having the knowledge of knowing what to do. It's like you give someone a job, they have to, before they can do the job, they need training. They need to have the knowledge, the information in order to do the job. You got to go to school, you got to get a degree, you got to get training, an apprenticeship, whatever it may be. You've got to have the training and the knowledge and the background in order to be able to do the job that you're supposed to do. And of course, it's not just about the actions, because there are many actions in Jewish life. There's things that you're supposed to do and things that you should not do. There's the do's and the don'ts. But even if we go deeper, the way those do's and don'ts are done and the deeper intention and the meaning behind those do's and don'ts are also very important and very critical. And it requires study and knowledge in order to have an appreciation of the deeper meaning behind those do's and don'ts. So for example, of course, especially when you study Kabbalah, when you study the deeper teachings of Judaism, you begin to learn and understand that commandments have a lot of deep meaning. They're not just ancient traditions. They're very meaningful and very relevant, very personal in our lives. But it requires the study and the knowledge in order to appreciate that. So again, we have a tradition that's filled with things that we need to do in order to have the knowledge of how to do them and what to do and what not to do, and to do them in the right way, on mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It requires a lot of study. One needs the background, one needs the knowledge in order to fulfill one's job, one's obligations in the proper way. So that's on a very, very simple, practical level why the study of Torah is so important. Number two, now we're going to start to dig a little deeper. Number two, we of course talk about personal growth in Kabbalah from the perspective and from the viewpoint of the struggle between the animal soul and the godly soul. When the Tanya, which is a book that really elucidates this struggle and this tension between two different forces within the human being, when the Tanya, in his introduction, the Tanya says that the struggle with books in general, spiritual books, spiritual, so to speak, self-help books, is that not every book speaks to every person, because people deal with different spiritual struggles, different moral, mental, emotional struggles in life. And where one book may address the struggles and may address the issues of one person, it may not necessarily address the struggles and issues of another person. So one person can read a book and get really excited about the book and be very, a person could be obsessed about a book and its meaning in their life, and to another person just doesn't speak to them. It doesn't speak and relate to their issues in their life. When the Alter Rebbe, the Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, wrote the Tanya, he said this book is different than any other book. And the reason he said that is he said that many books that deal with spiritual growth deal with symptoms, deal with certain specific spiritual struggles. I would like to have a book, he says, I'm writing a book that goes to the core of all of those struggles, goes to the heart of all of those struggles. So rather than deal with the specific spiritual issues, I'm going to deal with the underlying cause and core of it, which is the same in every human being. In other words, everyone, of course, has their own struggles, their own vices, their own areas in which they are battle, but the underlying core of that battle is the battle between the godly soul and the animal soul. And that is the battle between transcendence, transcending I, and the battle between that and self-orientation. That is the underlying battle. How it expresses itself, in one person it may be a battle of laziness, or for another person it's greed, for another person it's lust, for another person it may be lack of patience. So whatever it may be, everyone has their own vice, has their own areas of struggle. But really underlying those symptoms is the battle between transcendence, living for something beyond ourselves, or self-orientation. That is the key battle. Or as we've said before, that there is the famous expression, to be or not to be. In Judaism, we say, to be is not to be focused on self, not to be self-oriented. To be is not to be. That's the ultimate being, is not to be for oneself. But that is the essential battle, the battle between the godly soul and the animal soul. In the Tanya, it says that it's actually not hard to win this battle. That's the basis of the book. The book of the Tanya, and some of you have studied it on occasion or in the past at great length. The essence of the book is saying that it is not that hard to win the battle. You just need to have some information. It's like anything else. Sometimes you look at someone who's an expert in a certain area and they do something and you say, wow, how did you do that? It looks so difficult, so complicated. And many times they'll answer, if you have the right training and the right information, it's not that hard. It really isn't that hard. You just have to have the knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the background, of course it's hard. So what the Tanya says is that you need to have some information. And the information he says is understanding that the battle between the godly soul and the animal soul in many ways is the battle between the mind and the heart, between our impulses, which are self-oriented. I want, I need, I like, I have to have. Those are our impulses, versus our intellect that can actually try to be objective in looking at something and saying, is this right or is this wrong? Is this truth? Should I be doing this? Is this something that's appropriate for me? Is this fulfilling my purpose in creation? In other words, it is the battle between the mind and the heart. The heart, our impulses, sometimes want us to do something. So someone has cut us off on the road, and we may have an impulse to say something or do something. That's our impulse. Right? We get this natural impulse of anger or whatever it may be. And then we have a mind that says, is this the appropriate behavior? Is this something that is going to better the world in any way? Is this going to bring about anything good? Is there anything positive that's going to come out of this? So it's constantly really the battle. The Tanya really frames the battle between the animal soul and the godly soul as the battle between the mind and the heart. And the Tanya goes on to explain that in that battle, when you put the mind and the heart, as the example I've given many times before, in the boxing ring, the mind always wins. The mind is stronger than the heart. As strong as our impulses are, our mind can rule over the heart. And we see that we can do that. We know that we have the ability, if we want to contain our impulses and to be disciplined and do the right thing. Someone, Rabbi Shais Taub gives the example. He says, a parent who loses themselves and begins to shout and scream and totally let their anger out on their child. And then a stranger walks in. What happens in that moment? Suddenly they're, of course, ashamed, and they suddenly get a hold of themselves, and the shouting stops. If the mind cannot control the heart, how did that happen? We find ourselves all the time in places where, when we need to, our mind can control the heart. So the mind has the strength, has the dominance over the heart. The reason why we battle sometimes is because in order for the mind to win over the heart, it needs two things. Number one, it needs to be engaged in the process. You can't put the mind, You can't have a situation where before our mind begins to think, our impulses already have directed our actions, because then they haven't even battled. You've allowed the impulses to start without engaging the intellect. So you didn't put the mind into the boxing ring. There was only one being there. There was only one power there, which is the power of the impulses. So first of all, you have to engage the mind. But number two is you can't engage the mind with both its hands tied behind its back. In other words, if you put the mind in the boxing ring with the impulses, but both of its hands are tied behind its back, it can't win. What does that mean behind it? Its hands are tied behind its back. If the mind does not have knowledge, then it doesn't have the tools, it doesn't have boxing gloves that it can use in this battle. It needs information, it needs knowledge. The mind, when it has the right information, can, with that information, win over the animal soul, the impulses. So, in other words, the reason why study and knowledge is so important, and ongoing study and so on, is because we're feeding the mind the tools that it can use in its battle with our impulses. If it doesn't have knowledge, if it doesn't have information, it may be a very strong mind, but it's got its hands tied behind its back, and it has no tools that it can use. It doesn't have the tools that it can use in order to fight and battle with our impulses. So that is issue number two, is that why knowledge and information and education is so critical in the spiritual journey of the person, is because the mind needs information, and information is its fuel, and it's the tools that it uses in its battle with our impulses, in our battle with the animal soul. Just go on unmute if anyone wants to get any clarification on the first two reasons we have given so far why scholarship has always been so central to Jewish life. Okay, we're going to mute again and then continue now with other layers. Okay, so now we move on to another concept, is that one of the, as we've mentioned before, in the Zohar, in the original teachings of the Kabbalah, or one of the first primary sources of Kabbalistic teachings, as they are recorded, because it was something that was passed down traditionally through verbally through generations, but the first time we have a recording, an official recording of Kabbalah, is in the Zohar. And the Zohar talks about the concept that a mitzvah, when we talk about mitzvah, which means literally commandment, that's the literal meaning of the word, means commandment, also has a deeper meaning, that it's related to the word tzavta, which means, excuse me, which means connection. A mitzvah is a connection. What does it mean, a connection? It's about having a relationship. We, as human beings here in this world, one of the things we are striving to do is to have a relationship with God, to transcend our own self-orientation. What does that transcendence look like? Essentially, it's with having a relationship with God. And of course, as we've said many times before, if you are having an authentic relationship with God, by definition, you can be in an authentic relationship with other people, because they require the same underlying skill, which is being able to make sure that the focus of your life is not you. A person who is narcissistic, a person who is self-oriented, and of course, narcissistic is a very is a very powerful word, or a maybe like a little bit more than the average, maybe extreme. But there is, of course, many levels of that. When a person is self-oriented, the more self-oriented they are, the harder it is for them to be in authentic, good, healthy relationships. Relationships require that a person be able to transcend themselves, see the world from the other person's perspective, think about what they would like, what makes them feel good, how would they feel about so-and-so. That is transcendence of self. So they go hand in hand, and we're trying to have this relationship, of course, with others, but also with God. They go hand in hand, one and the same. So in this relationship, one of the ways we achieve this relationship is by doing mitzvahs. Mitzvahs, commandments, also mean connections, because when someone you love asks you, or you know they would like you to do something, and you do that, you are connecting with them. That's part of the relationship. You're doing something for that person. That's how you build and connect with that person. You are building a relationship by doing things for that individual. Mitzvahs, when God asks us to do certain things, we are building a relationship. And every time we do a mitzvah, we are connecting. That's what the word mitzvah, again, the word mitzvah means commandment, but it also means connecting. It's about a relationship and about being in a relationship. Now, when we talk about being in this relationship, we have to remember that the human being functions on 3 levels. Right? The Kabbalah always emphasizes that the person functions on the level of action, on the level of speech, and on the level of thought. They are referred to in the Kabbalah as the 3 garments of the soul. You have the soul with its intellectual and emotional capacities and traits. That's the person's soul. The soul can express itself in conscious thought, in speech, and in action. Those are the clothes that the soul puts on in order to relate to, in order to engage in the world we are in. So, and we call them, the reason we call them clothes is because the difference between your body and your clothes is that your body is something that you have that you can't change. Well, today, of course, there's all sorts of interesting surgeries people do to change their body, but generally speaking, your body is what it is. And the clothes is what you can take off and on and change one to the other. And that's why we call thought, speech, and action your clothes, because they're not intrinsically the soul. They are expressive capacities that can change. In other words, I can choose to say these words or to say other words, or sometimes preferably not to say any words at all, right? It's something I can choose, take on, take off, change it. The same thing is true regarding action. I can do one action, I can do a different action. I can express myself in one thing or another thing, or sometimes by not doing something. Thought is a little bit different. Thought, because Kabbalah says thought is the highest of those 3 garments, it is the closest to the soul. That is the reason why the clothing of the garments of thought cannot be stopped. As opposed to speech and action, you can choose to speak or not to speak, or to do or not to do. But thought, you don't have that choice. Thought, you've got to be thinking. If you're thinking not to think, you're thinking not to think. But you've got to, the mind is always thinking. It can never stop thinking, because it's the garment that's the closest to the soul. But why we anyways call it a garment is because we can choose. Sometimes it's a little hard, but with discipline, we can choose what our thought should be. It could be one thought or another thought. We can move our mind from one thought to another thought. We can discipline ourselves to say that is an unhealthy thought, for example. That's a toxic thought. That's not a good thought. And I do not want to entertain that thought. And I'm moving on to another thought. So, which, by the way, is sometimes when toxic thoughts are coming to our mind, I'm just going to mention this parenthetically, and we're trying not to think about it. Sometimes the best method is not to say, I don't want to think about it, because the more you tell yourself not to think something, right? You tell someone, don't think about, a certain thing. Of course, that's by nature, they're going to have to think about it. But rather than tell yourself not to think about it, is put your mind into something else. Study something, read something, get your mind focused on something else, divert it, right? Sometimes the best way of dealing with a child who's misbehaving is to not necessarily fight it head on, but to redirect and channel somewhere else. And the mind is very much the same way. When our mind is giving us a challenge and it's making it, and it wants to think toxic thoughts, thoughts that are unhealthy for us, we have to sometimes redirect those thoughts to healthier thoughts, rather than battle and say, don't think that, just think about something else, focus on another thought. But again, that's the concept of thought. So, and it says that being that the human being functions in those 3 areas, that's the way we relate to our world. In other words, you have the soul as it is for itself, but for the soul to connect with our world, it needs to use those 3 garments: thought, speech, and action. We don't have any other tools as human beings with which we can relate to other human beings and to the world at large. If you want to have a relationship with another human being, you have to either do something for them, say something. It may start with your thoughts, but that's the way we connect and relate to the world around us. That's why it says in the Kabbalah that when God created the world, he used the letter Hey, it says. He used the letter Hey. And the letter Hey in Jewish tradition has a line on the top and it has a line on the side, and then a little line on the other side. Those three pieces of the letter Hey, it represents the three dimensions of the world we live in as far as the human world, which is thought at the top, speech, which comes directly from that, and of course, action, which is a little bit more removed. We've spoken about that in the past, but that is the thought, speech, and action. So when we talk about a relationship with God, because remember, we're talking about having a relationship, there's a relationship we can achieve through our actions, there's the relationship we can achieve through our speech, and there's the relationship we can achieve through our thoughts. When we do something or say something that God wants us to do or say, we are connecting because this is what he wants us to do. So you now have a relationship, you're doing what he wants you to do. But it is a more external, and it is a more, it isn't as intimate as a relationship as when your thoughts are connected to God. Your thoughts are much deeper and much more connected to your soul. We know that to really be close to somebody, you need to know them, you need to understand them. If you know them, if you understand them, your relationship with them is on a much, much more intimate and deep level. In fact, it says that when the Torah uses, as we've shared before, when the Torah speaks about the first man and woman being physically intimate, the Torah uses the words, and Adam knew Eve. That is the words it uses. And it's not because the Torah is afraid to be more open and expressive and to use terms that are a little bit more graphic in nature. The Torah is not shy in that sense. The reason why the Torah uses those words is to tell us that that is what true intimacy is about. True intimacy is to know somebody, to know them, to really understand them, to be connected in our thoughts, in our minds. I know the other person, I understand the other person, I know their feelings, I know where they're coming from. So when we talk about a relationship with God, there's a relationship we build through the actions we do, there's a relationship we build through the speech that we do, and there's a relationship we build through our thoughts. When our thoughts are thinking godly things, or thinking God's thoughts, we have a much more intimate relationship. It's not as peripheral. When you do an action, think about when you do a mitzvah. When you would do a mitzvah, you do a good deed, you may feel good about doing it, you may think it's a wonderful thing, but not necessarily does it affect you psychologically and emotionally. It may or may not. It not necessarily every time that a person lights a Shabbat candle, do they necessarily have to feel anything. But when you study something and you understand it, that automatically affects you in a very internal way. Your mind now is connected. And that connection, of course, leads to the emotions, which we'll get to soon. But that is a much more intimate relationship. So again, when we talk about reason number 3, why scholarship is so important, because in the context of relationships, it's knowing and understanding that's a much more intimate relationship than just actions and doing. And that's why the study of Torah is unique amongst the Jewish practices that it allows for. It gives us the ability to have a much more intimate relationship with God. That is another concept. So far, just to review so far, number 1, practically we need to know what to do and how to do Judaism, and you need the manual, so to speak, the manual that allows you to know what to do. So that's why the study of Torah is so important. Number 2, in the battle between the animal soul and the godly soul, in the battle between the mind versus our impulses, our mind needs tools, and the tools it needs is the knowledge. Without knowledge, it cannot fight the battle with the animal soul. It doesn't have the tools to do so, so it needs to be empowered with knowledge. And number 3, we're talking about the concept of a relationship. And in relationships, our minds, we need to know and understand the other person, or we need to know and understand in order to have a deeper relationship. And conceptually in Kabbalah, it says that when you're studying Torah, you're studying God's thoughts, the way he thinks. And you're developing a relationship on the level of thought and intellect, which is a much more intimate relationship. Okay, we'll unmute to see if there's any questions at this point before we go on. Okay, we will continue. Reason number 4, why scholarship has always played such a central and important role in Jewish life is because much of what we are trying to do is to, much of what we're trying to do is to work on our emotions. It says in Kabbalah, very interestingly, that God created the world with 10 different spheres. He used 10 spiritual spheres in order to create the world. They correspond to the 10 spiritual soul capacities within every human being. Every human being's soul is made of 3 intellectual capacities and 7 emotional capacities. And God used these 10 building blocks of reality in order to create the world. That's why, according to our tradition, God used 10 utterances in the creation of the world. When God created the world, he used 10 different expressions. Like you see, God said, let there be light, let there be this. And every day he says different things. The Kabbalah says, if you count them, you will see that there are 10 utterances. They correspond to the 10 commandments. We have 10 utterances that God used to create the world. They correspond to the 10 commandments because the concept of the 10 commandments is to imbue and to permeate the world with holiness. So we have 10 commandments to imbue the world that was created with holiness, that was created with 10 utterances. That's the 10 commandments and the 10 utterances that God used to create the world. But what's interesting is that when we talk about the days of the week, we're told that each day of the week represents a different capacity that God uses in creation. And therefore we have 7 days, because 7 days correspond to the 7 emotions. So the obvious question then is that we should really not have 7 days, we should have 10 days, because there are 10 spiritual capacities in total. And so why is it that God creates in 7 days and we have a 7-day week corresponding to the 7 emotions versus a 10-day week that God should have used in corresponding to these 10 spiritual capacities? And the Kabbalah explains the reason for this is because the 7 represents our emotions. And when we talk about what we are naturally, what the world is naturally, in other words, in its untamed, in its raw form, the world is a world of 7, of emotions. It goes back to what we said before, impulses, emotions. In other words, what is the natural world? The natural world, without effort, without us trying to make it better in its raw natural state, is a world of emotions. That's what a human being is in his raw form, without working on refining. Emotions, impulses, desires, right? That begin, and by the way, all emotions and all impulses begin with a certain subjectivity. That subjectivity is I. Because if I have an emotion, I want something, it always begins with an I want this, I like this, I dislike that. It always begins with the subjectivity of first I am here, I want, I need, I like, whatever it may be, as opposed to, of course, the intellect, which comes from can come from a more objective perspective. It has that capacity. So the reason why the world was created with 7 days is because there are 7 emotions, and the world in its natural raw state is a place of emotion, impulse. And the work of man is to introduce intellect and to use the mind to refine that world. So that's the way we get to the 10 utterances, 10 commandments. That's our role. Our role is to take a world which is 7, just emotional, just impulsive in nature. And our job is to use the mind and the knowledge and the information to change and transform those feelings and those impulses. So in other words, not just what we were saying earlier to control the impulses, we also want to transform those impulses. In other words, it's not just about the boxing ring between mind and impulse. It's also about how do we transform our impulses to be more positive impulses, because emotions are a part of creation. They are a part of the human being, and they play a critical role. We don't want people to be robots that have no emotions. We want emotions, but we just want healthy emotions. Emotions that are directed in a healthy way. And in order to direct those emotions, we need the mind. The mind can not only control impulses, it can transform impulses. It can elevate them. It can change them. As we've said before, that it's not just a matter of mind over matter, that mind over the heart. that the mind can dominate the heart, there is also the concept that emotions actually are created through the mind. Not only does the mind control them, that not only can the mind overcome emotions, it actually creates emotions. As we've said many times in Kabbalah, that intellect is called, in Kabbalah, when we refer to the three capacities of intellect, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, they are referred to as the parents of emotions. Wisdom is the father, understanding is the mother, right? If you think about the way a child is conceived, the father provides the sperm, the seed, but then that seed has to be developed through many months of the gestation period in which the child is developed. So you have the kernel of a thought, the flash of an idea, that's the wisdom, that's the father of the process. Then you have the understanding, which is taking that and developing that concept. So in other words, let's say you're starting with a business idea and you got just a flash of inspiration. So that's the flash. Then you got to develop the business plan. You got to develop, okay, well, how's this going to work? And what is it going to look like? And how does this process, that's developing it, that's taking the child, the seed, and the gestation period of developing that child. And and when you have wisdom and understanding, and they are intimate, which is what in the sense of, that's what knowledge is. Knowledge is that we take that understanding now and we connect with it in a very, very profound way. Then that idea can give birth to emotions. In other words, of course, many ideas don't make us feel anything. They remain just abstract ideas. They're meaningless to us. But some ideas, if we actually focus on those ideas and contemplate and meditate upon them at great length, sometimes we can use them to create emotions. Emotions are born out of our perspectives. And then, of course, it's very simple and to understand that you feel a certain way because you see things in a certain way. Your feelings are based on the way is based on your perspective. And so, of course, if we want to not just dominate our emotions, if we want to transform our emotions, we need our minds and we need our intellect with the right information to transform those emotions, to take those 7 days, which represent the 7 emotions, and to lift them up, not just to control them, but to lift them up. So our emotion of love, which is an emotion of attraction, is attracted to the right things, to healthy things, to things that are about spirituality or about transcendence or meaning, that we have a love and a passion for doing kindness for others. We love that. We really are attracted to that concept of helping and being a source of blessing for other people, versus lust just for material objects and fulfilling our lusts and so on and so forth. So every emotion can be transformed and uplifted, but in order to do so, you need the mind to create and to give birth to and to conceive healthy emotions. So that is reason number 4 in the process of why scholarship is very important in this process. And of course, we'll have a review sheet at the end, so we'll be able to go over all of these reasons. I'm just going to now conclude with reason number 5. Reason number 5 is that many of the things that we spoke about before are talking about our personal growth, which is part of the reason we are here, to have a relationship with God, to dominate and to control our impulses, and to, as we've just said, to also create positive impulses, to create positive emotions through the mind. The mind conceives emotions. It's the parents that allows us to have emotions. So when our mind is filled with the right knowledge and right information and the right perspective, we can create positive emotions. But there is another, of course, piece to all of this, as we've said many times before, is that we are also here for a larger mission and a larger purpose, and that is to make the world better, to move the world forward. Judaism is based on a faith that the world does not have to be a dysfunctional place. The world's not supposed to be a dysfunctional place. The world can and is supposed to be a world of justice, a world of kindness, a world of truth, a world of empathy, a world in which all physical maladies and diseases are cured, a world in which there is affluence, in which there is no hunger, every human being has the sustenance they need, and a world in which people are focused on higher meaning and purpose. That's Judaism's belief and its dream and vision for the world. And Judaism says that it is incumbent upon us to believe in that dream, and not only believe in it, but to anticipate it and desire it and work towards it every day. And as far-fetched as that dream might be, that's why it's called a dream. If it was that easy, and if it was that close to us, it wouldn't be a dream. As far-fetched as that dream sometimes seems, Judaism says it is our moral obligation to believe in that and to help bring the world towards that. In other words, to look at a world in which there is injustice, to look at a world in which there is pain, in which there is tremendous suffering, and just to shrug your shoulders and say, I'm okay with that, or just that's the way it is, and we're just going to make peace with that, and we're just going to allow that to continue and not protest that. Judaism says that is immoral. It is immoral to see a world in which people suffer so much and to say, this is just the way it is, there's nothing we can do about it. Judaism says we may not solve everything today, but we have a responsibility in our little own corner of the world to do what we can to make something better for somebody. Everyone has their sphere of influence, everyone has their area in which they can touch people's lives and change and transform. And of course, that's our mission, is to bring about that transformation. But this concept of believing in, anticipating, desiring a brighter future for our world requires an imagination, requires it requires us to be able to envision that reality. If you don't have that imagination, if you can't conceive that kind of a reality, then you can't want it, anticipate it, and believe in it. So critical to this central mission of Judaism, the underlying mission of Judaism of bringing our world to a better time and place, is the ability to imagine and to be able to envision that kind of reality. You know, there's an old parable, just to kind of bring this home. There's an old parable about a beggar, that they asked this beggar who goes from door to door, knocking on the doors and begging for food and alms and money. They asked him, so what is your dream when the Mashiach will come, when the Messiah will come? What's your hope? And he says, my hope is when the Mashiach will come, I'm hoping and praying that there'll be many, many more doors for me to beg on, to knock on. And of course, it's foolish, because that's the lack of imagination. Your dream should be that you should no longer need to beg, and you should have everything you need, so you don't have to go begging on doors and knocking on doors. But in the beggar's world, he can't imagine a reality outside of the begging. So what's the best possibility? A lot more doors to knock on. That is lacking the vision and lacking the imagination of what it could be. And many of us are guilty of that, whether we realize it or not. We make peace with, and we believe that the world can only be what it is, or we can only be what we are, because we can't envision and we don't have the imagination for something greater and bigger. You have to be able to imagine it, and you have to be able to envision it in order to achieve it. If you don't have a dream, it all starts with that dream. If you don't have that dream, if you don't have that vision, then how are you supposed to want it, anticipate it, and work towards it? There's a great expression that says, the future you see is the future you get. You have to see it. You have to have a dream and a vision for it. And I think this relates a lot to this, the reality that we're in right now when we talk about Corona, the COVID-19, and people's being in a compromised situation where people are still social distancing, and life isn't what it should be, and people are kind of off, and the economy and the effect it's having on the elderly, and lots of issues and challenges that many people are facing. And for a lot of people, their imagination is, we just want to go back to the way it was. We just want to go back to normal. Let's go back to normal. And Judaism would challenge that and say, is that the extent of your imagination? Or can you envision something bigger? Can you envision something greater? Is that all we really want, is to go back to a pre-corona reality? I'm not saying we shouldn't want that. The question is that the extent of our wish? Is that the extent of our dream and vision? Because the world, the pre-corona world, It is a world with a lot of problems, a lot of challenges and issues, and it's not the reality that we can achieve, that we should be working towards achieving. We should think about and should envision something greater. But that vision requires knowledge. It requires information. You can't imagine and you can't have a dream and a vision that you have no knowledge about. So part of what Torah study is about, and the scholarship of Judaism is about, is helping us develop a vision, helping us develop a framework of understanding of what we could look like, what our lives could look like, and what the world could look like. And that dream and that vision is what gives us the ability to imagine and then work towards that possibility, that reality, right? If you've got to believe and you have to envision certain things in order for them to change. You know, one of the great revolutions of Judaism has always been the concept of how we see and view time. In the ancient pagan world, they understood time, as we've said many times before, they understood time to be cyclical. Cyclical means things don't change. There's just cycles. There's seasons, winter, summer, spring, people are born, people live, and they die, and everything and whatever's happened will continue to happen. Nothing changes. So one of the revolutions of the whole way that human beings think that Judaism brought about, this revolution that time actually is not just cyclical. Yes, it has a cyclical nature. There are cycles to time, but it is also linear. Linear means that there's the possibility for progress. Things can change, things can get better. Just because we've had problems in the past, or dysfunction or immorality or injustice in the past, does not mean that it has to be that way in the future. We can make progress as human beings. We can change things. We can make progress as individuals. Just because I had certain vices or weaknesses in the past in my life doesn't mean I always have to. I can change those things. Those things can be better. And when we talk about words like hope, dream, vision, the vocabulary of those words are based on the idea that there is a greater vision that we can believe in, something more, something greater. But we have to have the imagination for it. Otherwise, we're like the beggar. We just can't, we can't get out of that paradigm. We need to be able to view and be aware of a greater paradigm in order to want it, desire it, anticipate it, and work towards it. And that is also, again, critical piece, and why scholarship is so important, because it is the learning of Torah which gives us the vision and the dream that Torah has for our world. And if you don't have the dream, you can't work towards it. If you don't see it, if it's not part of your vision, then it's not something that it's even within your paradigm. Then there's no possibility. If you don't have the paradigm for it, there's no possibility of you believing in it, anticipating, and working towards it. So again, this is reason number 5 why the scholarship plays such a critical role in Jewish life. I'll unmute and take some questions if there are any, and then we will go over the review sheets. Okay, questions, thoughts, or comments? That means everyone is totally speechless. Okay, yes. Okay, so I'm gonna.
Sorry, is this how we can bring about redemption?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm just using maybe different words, but that's what redemption is about. Redemption is, and redemption can happen in stages. It can happen on a personal level. People go through their own personal redemption. We can go through a redemption as a community, as a country. We can go through redemption, and there are many steps to redemption. When you change things in society, in your own life, for example, in society, and you say, you know what, we're going to mandate that you can't be cruel to animals. I'm just giving you that example. We're going to make it the law that you cannot be cruel to animals, and you could be punished for being cruel to animals. That's a positive development and a positive movement that Judaism has spoken about for 3,000 years, the importance of how you treat animals. But that's a redemption of sorts, because we had the imagination, we had the vision to be able to see and understand that something is right or wrong, and then work towards that. Maybe mankind 500 years ago didn't have that imagination, didn't have that view, couldn't believe in the possibility of living in a world that would be that concerned about the feelings, not only of another human being, but also of an animal, of a creature. and so on and so forth. So redemption can happen on many levels, but we've got to have a vision. We have to have a dream, and that's what the scholarship is about, is giving us at least the vision, the paradigm to know what is possible, what could be, what it could look like. You have to know what it could look like in order to work towards that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share the review
Rabbi?
sheet here.
Rabbi?
Yes, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's not a question. I just want to tell you, because you said earlier that they're speechless people. To be honest with you, I speak for myself. Your sermon today, I think, left all of us speechless. So we're processing all you said. It was a very wonderful sermon. So thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. Let's go here. Sorry. Kabbalah Cafe. Hopefully you can see that on your screens. You can take a picture of it if you need to. This is feeding the mind, it's called. There are many reasons for the Jewish obsession with scholarship, and we're going to give 5 reasons. The knowledge directs our practical observance. Again, you need to know how to do mitzvot and how to live as a Jew, and not only the mechanics of it, but the deeper reasons to inspire us and so on. But that requires knowledge. The second reason, which is number 3 here, the key to winning the battle with our impulses is the innate dominance of the mind over the heart. The key is to make sure the mind has the ammunition it needs. The mind cannot fight the impulses and control the impulses without ammunition. It needs tools, and that is knowledge and information. Next reason, a mitzvah is about a connection. Connecting the mind is the deepest form, it should say. Sorry, it's the deepest form of connection. So when we use our mind and think about godly matters, spiritual matters, that is the deepest connection to God. It's the most intimate connection. The next reason is feelings can be changed through the mind, and based on the information that the mind has, we can not only control our impulses, we can transform them, we can lift them up. And finally, the goal of believing and anticipating a brighter future requires our imagination for that possibility. You have to be able to imagine it. It's got to be something you can envision. The future you see is the future you get. And that is another reason, again, for creating the dream, creating the paradigm and the vision we need to study in order to have that vision and that dream. So that is, again, called Feeding the Mind. You can take a picture of it if you need on your devices. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful week of blessing, success in all your endeavors. And we should come together, God willing, in person, in good health, and be able to work towards a brighter and better tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Excellent. Very well done.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and everyone.
Hey, Lanny.
It was very nice.
Sorry.
Wonderful.